And welcome to the Barry Foster Show, coming to you from the City of Charm, beautiful downtown Avon Park, Florida, here in the Ridge Florist Studios. Remember, if you have any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions, we're glad to respond to them. Just put them in the comments below. If you have not yet subscribed, we would ask you please to subscribe. Share this with a friend. That as we push towards 1,000 subscribers and some exciting things coming in the very near future, we'll tell you more about those later. But actually, I thought we'd talk a little bit about Independence Day. Today is Independence Day, July the 4th. But what does that mean? The day the Declaration of Independence was signed, right? Well, by who? And how did this document come to be? And more importantly, what exactly does it say? And I don't think there's any better day than today to take a look at the Declaration of Independence, to talk about the document, which really has come to be a template for the idea of free people in society all around the world. Because at the time, this Declaration of Independence established for the first time in the world that a nation would be based on unalienable rights, that is, the rights from God. It would be based on the rule of law and unlimited government. The Declaration and the Constitution are documents that really limit government. This is a republic, a constitutional republic. It is not, as some would try to tell you, a democracy. In fact, the founders really had no use for a democracy where a majority would rule. The majority could trample the rights of the minority. This was to be a republic where the rule of law prevailed. There would be no kings. I mean, they had looked at Europe. They had seen Europe. They had no use for Europe. And as over the course of time, their ideas were to get away from the way Europeans had done things. And I would recommend to you a book called The 5,000-Year Leap, when the founders really began to look at different forms of government and try to put together a government where the people, an educated people, a Christian people, would be able to form their own government through representatives who would make rules that 99% couldn't take away from you, because they were your unalienable rights. That is, the rights given to us by God, not by some government that could be taken away. The colonists really had started to come here in the 1600s. As we know, the Pilgrims came here not only to escape British tyranny, but to start a new life. And they came to a total different area. There was no civilization here per se. It was the Europeans establishing their own forms of government, establishing their own colonies, and each one of the colonies, like little countries, had their own individual relationships with the crown, with England. And more people came to start a new life in the new world. And it wasn't until the colonies began to find that they had mutual interest that they began to band together. Because as the colonies progressed, the crown, England, wanted a bigger and bigger piece of the pie. My research shows that this has been going on for a while, but it really began in 1766 with the Sugar Act, where they raised the duty on sugar to get a few more dollars out of the sugar that came in. Then there was a Currency Act, where colonies couldn't print their own money. Then there was a Quartering Act, where British troops coming to the New World could just throw people out of their homes and set up their headquarters there, just throw you out. And the first actual act, the first actual tax, I believe, was the Stamp Act, which was the first direct tax, where they put taxes on newspapers, broadsides, pamphlets, legal documents, even dice and playing cards. And as this began to go along, the colonists began to rebel. There were protests. And in fact, they began to have groups called the Sons of Liberty. And this was no national group with a giant Sons of Liberty national headquarters where the groups kind of trickled down. These were just groups of men that had met in the pubs and decided that they were tired. They had gone to get away from the crown, and here was the King of England insinuating himself on them once again, and there were protests. And in fact, there were some that were so violent that they first repealed the Stamp Act and lifted the Stamp Act, but the protests continued on, and then there came the Boston Massacre. And if you've not read about this, the short version is it was a large protest. There were a number of British regulars there. They opened fire on the crowd. They killed 3, wounded 2 others, and word of that spread like wildfire. Later, they put on the Boston Tea the Tea Act, which was to put a tax on tea, which of course they were very unhappy about. So a number of colonists dressed up like Indians boarded a ship and threw tea into the harbor. And many people don't know that the Boston Tea Party is the most famous, but there were other tea parties, even in upstate New York, as well. And after that, the Brits passed the Intolerable Acts, which were more taxes and more restrictions upon the colonists. And more colonists really became convinced that the British Parliament intended to take away their freedom. After fighting broke out in Massachusetts in the spring of 1775, the king declared the colonists in, quote, a state of open and avowed rebellion. And it was at that time there was a group of colonists who began to seriously consider cutting ties with Britain, which was a revolutionary thought. So they had elected delegates to attend a Continental Congress. As the colonies began to come together, they put together a group called the Continental Congress that really, for all intents and purposes, became the governing body of the Union during the Revolution. Their second meeting convened in Philadelphia in 1775. The delegates to Congress adopted strict rules of secrecy because the Brits were not very happy with, they were traitors in their eyes. They wanted to protect the cause of American liberty and their own lives for that matter. So it looked like by the end of the first year, most delegates decided that there was not going to be any hope of any reconciliation with Britain. It was on June 7th of 1776 that it really began to come to a head. That's when a gentleman by the name of Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Acting under the instruction of the Virginia Convention, the Lee Resolution contained 3 parts: a declaration of independence, a call to form foreign alliances, and a plan for confederation. About a week later, June 11th, the Congress appointed 3 committees in response to the Lee Resolution. One was to draft a Declaration of Independence. A second committee was to draw up a plan for forming foreign alliances, and a third to prepare and digest the form of a confederation, a group of states. Yes, even back then, they didn't have consultants, but they went and put committees together to study the efficiency of going after these 3 different plans or these parts of the Lee Resolution. Because members of the Congress believed the actions Lee proposed to be premature, they deferred them until July the 2nd. They gave about 3 weeks to look into that. It was on that date, July 2nd, Congress adopted the first part, which was the Declaration of Independence. The vote on the Lee Resolution, by the way, was 12 to 0 to 1. New York did not cast a vote. In fact, they didn't cast a vote until after the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 9th of 1776. The plan for making treaties wasn't approved until September of that year, and the plans for confederation were delayed until 1777. So It was really in June when Richard Henry Lee read his resolution, which began resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that it really began to occur. And the Lee resolution really was kind of an expression of what was already beginning to happen in the colonies. When the Second Continental Congress, which really was operating as the government of the United States, first met in 1775, King George had not replied to a petition for the redress of grievances that had been sent by the First Continental Congress. And as the Congress began to take on the responsibilities of a national government, they established a Continental Army. We've just seen their 250th anniversary here, as well as a continental currency. And they'd created a post office for what they at the time were calling the United Colonies. It was in August of 1775, a royal proclamation had declared that the subjects were engaged in open and avowed rebellion. It was later in 1775 that Parliament had passed what they called the American Prohibitory Act, which made all American vessels and cargoes forfeit to the British Crown. In May of 1776, Congress learned that the king had negotiated treaties with Germany to hire mercenaries to fight in America. And it was looking to many of the colonists like England was treating the colonies as really a foreign country. And one by one, you begin to see the Continental Congress cutting their colonies' ties to Britain. The privateering resolution, which was in March of 1776, allowed colonists to fit out armed vessels to cruise on the enemies of the United Colonies. The next month, in April of 1776, American ports were open to commerce with other nations, an action that severed the economic ties which were part of the Navigation Acts. At the same time, more of the colonists themselves were becoming convinced of the inevitability of independence. Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, the pamphlet Common Sense, which was published in January of 1776. It's sold by the thousands. By the middle of May of 1776, eight colonies had decided that they would support independence. On May the 15th of 1776, the Virginia Convention passed the resolution that the delegates appointed to represent Virginia in the General Congress were instructed to propose that body declare the United Colonies free and independent states. And that's when Richard Henry Lee presented his resolution. There were still some delegates who wished to try to reconcile with Britain. On June the 11th of 1776, the consideration of the Lee resolution was postponed by a vote of 7-5. New York abstained. Congress then recessed for 3 weeks. And it looked like at that time the Lee resolution would be adopted, but that's when they appointed the Committee of Five. And the Committee of Five was put together regionally, actually. There was 2 men from New England, John Adams of Massachusetts and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. 2 men from the Middle Colonies, which would be Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania and Robert Livingston of New York, and 1 Southerner way down in Virginia, which would be Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that other members of the committee had unanimously pressed him alone to undertake doing the draft, to actually write the Declaration of Independence. And he looked back after 50 years and said that the document's purpose was never meant to be thoroughly original. Its purpose wasn't to articulate anything that hadn't been said before, but to make the case for the American colonies in plain terms and to persuade the world to see that it was intended to be an expression of the American mind. He finished this defense of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in a little more than 2 weeks. And it was revised first by the Committee of Five, mostly by Franklin, who was the editor, and then by the Second Continental Congress. There were 86 edits to that document. The Second Continental Congress removed whole sections, and the one that angered him the most, and the one that we probably don't know the most about, was the removal of a particular clause that blamed the king for forcing the slave trade on the American colonies. There's actually 5 distinct parts of the Declaration of Independence. There's the preamble, the body, which actually can be divided into 2 sections, a conclusion. The introduction states that this document will declare the causes that have made it necessary for the American colonies to leave the British Empire, having started in the introduction that independence is unavoidable, even necessary. The preamble sets out the principles that were already recognized to be self-evident, that they were plain as the nose on your face by most 18th century Englishmen, closing with a statement that a long train of abuses and usurpations, if this is a design to reduce a people under absolute despotism in their right, it's their duty to throw off such a government and provide a new government that guards their future security. The first section of the body of the Declaration gives evidence of the long train of abuses and usurpations heaped upon the colonists by King George III. The second section of the body states that the colonists had appealed in vain to their quote-unquote British brethren for a redress of their grievances, having stated that the conditions that made independence necessary, and having shown that those conditions existed in British North America, the Declaration concludes that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain should be totally dissolved. It is an amazing document as you look through the way it was put together. For instance, the preamble, the first part of the Declaration, contains the assertion of individual rights. The most famous line, I would say, is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It goes on to say that if the government tries to take those rights away, the people have the right to form a new government. Jefferson also addresses a counterclaim in that section, saying that prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. It was interesting as Jefferson began to write these things, it really looks back as to not only the Lee Resolution, but several other documents that he had with him to kind of outline what the Declaration of Independence would be based upon. As he took June 12th and 13th to begin to read and write through this declaration that he was penning, he used several of his own documents that declare the causes that made it self-evident that they should get away from British rule. Historians note that Jefferson had with him a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which already had been printed in the Pennsylvania Gazette. That document asserted the rights of nature and maintained that the purpose of government was to ensure that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. It was Adams that said that they had asked Jefferson to write this because of the eloquence of his pen, which he did. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is made up of 5 distinct parts. There's the introduction, there's the preamble, there's the body, which can be divided into 2 sections, and a conclusion. The introduction states that this document will declare the causes that have made it necessary for the American colonies to leave the British Empire. Having stated in the introduction that the independence is unavoidable, even necessary, the preamble sets out principles that already were recognized to be self-evidence, that everyone could see, plain as the nose on your face, by most 18th century Englishmen at any rate. And it closes with a statement that a long train of abuses and usurpations says, if this is a desire to reduce a people under absolute despotism, it's their right, their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. The first section of the body of the Declaration gives evidence of the long train of abuses and usurpations heaped upon the colonists by King George III, mostly his inability to take care of things the colonies had asked him to take care of. He'd refused to pass laws for the accommodation of large districts of people. He'd forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He'd refused to assent to laws that he had to give his okay to, and he just basically ignored them. He called together legislative bodies at places unusual and uncomfortable and distant from where the public records were kept. The idea, they believed, was to fatigue the colonies into compliance. He'd make them go through long carriage rides to places out in the woods where they couldn't get at their documents. They couldn't just look it up on their phones. Right? They couldn't take their laptops with them. This was if they didn't have the documents there at hand, and they were cumbersome to carry around all this parchment. He dissolved representative houses for opposing his invasions of the rights of the people. He refused for a long time to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative had returned to the people at large. There's 27 different usurpations and abuses of power, and they were very unhappy, and they ended up 12-0-1. Again, New York did not vote to adopt the Declaration of Independence. And although the Congress had adopted the Declaration, it was only signed by the President of Congress, John Hancock. He was the first to sign this giant parchment, it's 24 by 29, and used a large signature, which, as history states, he said, was so that the blind King of England could even read it. The other delegates began to sign at the right below the text. Their signatures were arranged according to the geographic location of the states they represented. New Hampshire, which was the northernmost state at the time, began the list. Georgia, the southernmost, ended it. Eventually, 56 delegates signed, although all were not present on August 2nd to get it done. As the war went on, many would run in, sign, and leave. And in fact, among the later signers were Elbridge Gerry, Oliver Wolcott, Lewis Morris, Thomas McKean, and Matthew Thornton, who found that he had no room to sign, that they'd already had written in. And so they had wanted the document to be what they called engrossed, which was to be written by a man with great hand. It would be fancy. And so it took them a while to get that redone and re-signed. And they had signed some of the signatures afterwards, and they said some of them were so good that it was hard to tell that it wasn't the original signers that had signed it. But interestingly enough, the words of the Declaration of Independence didn't gain immediate prominence, even though the Dunlap broadsides, which were copies that were sent out to others to be read in public situations, it didn't really resound until really 1789, when the French Revolution copied it. The Haitian Revolution followed soon after, and they used it. In 1945, the Vietnam leader Ho Chi Minh invoked the Declaration of Independence when declaring Vietnam free from the French. It was Vietnam, no longer French Indochina. The women's suffrage movement adopted the Declaration of Independence for their cause in 1848, saying that men and women were created equal. It was interesting that the Declaration of Independence has, in later years, and sometimes it takes a while for these documents to prove their worth, and prove what they have done for this country. There was no other country that has been established like this, and this really broke ground. So, how long did it take to bring this together? Well, it took several years to end up with what we now know as the Declaration of Independence. What does it say? Well, it says that we are put together as a country of individuals whose rights were self-evident, that our rights come from God and not from government, and that this is a constitutional republic, a republic that would be established on the rule of law. And it took 5 long years of fighting for this to end up finally with America breaking loose and being a free and independent country. This is what we're celebrating today, the Declaration of Independence. And it is based, unlike what some people will tell you, it is really based on Christian principles. I mean, Jefferson himself said, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they're not to be violated, but with His wrath," that's God's wrath, capital H. "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that His justice cannot sleep forever." The founders really never intended that God's word or His principles should be separated from public life. You hear a lot about separation of church and state. That was written in a private letter by Jefferson to a private individual, but they turned this into an elastic cause that somehow that the founders were to believe that the government and God should be totally separate. I mean, some of the founders, Noah Webster, who said that the religion which has introduced civil liberty is the religion of Christ and His apostles. This is genuine Christianity. To this we owe our free constitutions of government. Patrick Henry, "Whether this new government will prove a blessing or a curse will depend upon the use of our people, that they make of blessings which are a gracious gift that God has bestowed on us. If they are wise, they'll be great and happy. If they are of contrary character, they'll be miserable. Righteousness alone can exalt them as a nation," which was a quote from Proverbs 14. So when you look at this, realize that, in fact, it was John Quincy Adams in 1837 that said that the Independence Day should be celebrated much the same as Christmas, because what Christ did for us in absolving us from our sins is what the Lord did for us governmentally by creating a society based on rights given by God. In fact, John Quincy Adams, in a speech in 1837, indicated he believed that the establishment of the country fulfilled Scripture when it said it was a country formed in a day. I would urge you to take this Independence Day and to look into the Declaration of Independence. It is flowery language. It's a little bit like reading the King James Version of the Bible. It takes a while to unpack. If you need to look online and look for an NIV version, a version more in real text that you can understand, I think that you would be well to do that, to look at the way that the founders came together. And we haven't even gotten into Washington, whose prayer life was legendary. But today is Independence Day. It is the day that we celebrate the creation of the United States of America through the Declaration of Independence. Although it was actually established on July 2nd, many people thought that July 2nd should be the Independence Day. But when we go to watch the fireworks and hear the patriotic songs, I think it would do well for us to do a little bit of research into this day and into this idea of us being free individuals, and to begin to unpack this. And as we become more literate and more understanding on how the Declaration came together and what it says, is that we share it with our friends, that we share it with our acquaintances, and that we celebrate independence as it should be. And really understand that the reading of the Declaration and the spreading of it goes well into July. We began what I refer to as the High Holy Days of Patriotism back on May the 30th with Memorial Day. But June the 7th is really the Lee Resolution and the beginnings of the Independence Day. The 15th of June is Flag Day. And as we get into the end of June and the beginning of July, we see the formation of the Declaration of Independence, which culminates with the signing by John Hancock on July 4th, and then the reading of the Dunlap broadsides and other things that happen in the colonies. And I think it bears us well to bring these all together to take a look at them. I hope that gives you a little kind of insight into why we celebrate Independence Day, the formulation of the Declaration of Independence, and moreover, what it says. We'll be back with more guests coming up soon. If you have any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions, please put them in the comments below so we can respond to them. If you would like, please like us and subscribe to us and tell a friend. As we continue to pursue truth, justice, and the American way, this is Barry Foster, and we'll see you next time.